Good day to all of you who are joining us from around the world. Welcome to the Sigur Center for Asian Studies' second Taiwan Roundtable this year. This time, it's on the Biden administration's approach to Asia and views on Taiwan. I'm happy to say that we're expecting a packed house, so to speak. Well, it's just a little over 100 days since Joe Biden took office. And when we started putting this panel together, I was a little worried whether there would be enough in Biden's Asia-Taiwan policy to talk about. Many of us thought that his team would be laser focused domestically on COVID and the economy. Well, instead, the Biden administration, I think, is well on its way to making a mark in Asia with a more wide-ranging and active foreign policy and engagement than most of us expected, including on Taiwan. And the question before the panel today is, what have we learned in the first 100 days about how the Biden team views Taiwan strategically and economically? What are the prospects of cooperation bilaterally and multilaterally? And how does Taiwan really fit into Biden's Asia or Indo-Pacific overarching framework? So in order to do this, we have three extremely accomplished speakers from the West Coast and the East Coast to give their thoughts on some of the key issues, including defense, economy, and foreign policy with Derek Grossman, Barbara Weisel, and Bob Sutter. So I'm delighted to now introduce them to you just briefly because they have very long and distinguished bios, and that is available on the program that you can consult. So first to tell us about U.S. defense strategy and Taiwan is Derek Grossman. He's a senior analyst at the Rand Corporation in sunny Santa Monica. Apparently it has a few clouds today, sorry. Derek focuses on a range of national security policy and Indo-Pacific security and brings a background of think tank, government experience, and teaching. His particular interest is on China's relationship in East Asia, especially nowadays with Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, and India. His background includes work with in the government with the Director of Defense Intelligence Agency, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Security. And he is, in terms of his media presence, he's very widely quoted in major global and national news outlets. And I know from personal experience, he's very active on Twitter. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California. Following Derek on looking at defense, we will then move to Barbara Weisel, who is the managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, which is an international economic policy advisory firm. She will give her views on economic relations and priorities for U.S.-Taiwan cooperation. And Barbara brings a wealth of experience in international economic negotiations and policymaking on Asia. She served most recently as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And of particular note, she was the chief U.S. negotiator for the 12-country Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Not an easy job, to say the least, as it turned out. In addition, Barbara has led efforts to expand U.S. market access, working with many foreign governments, particularly on a variety of cutting-edge issues such as intellectual property, digital trade, financial services, and product standards. So let me add that she also served as a negotiator of free trade agreements with Malaysia, Thailand, Australia, and Singapore. So she's really well versed to talk about possible trade agreement with Taiwan, among other economic issues I'm sure she's going to cover today. And then to wrap up the panel, we have my colleague, Bob Sutter. He's a professor of practice of international affairs at the Elliott School here at GW. And he will give his assessment of Biden's 100 days and ask, where is the Biden team headed in East Asia and Taiwan? Bob also brings senior government experience ranging from the Congressional Research Service to the National Intelligence Council, as well as academia. Suffice it to say that Bob has published 22 books, over 300 articles, and several hundred government reports. Let me just give a plug for his most recent book, as a good colleague, Chinese Foreign Relations, Power and Policy of an Emerging Global Fourth. It's in its 5th edition, mind you. All right. With that, a word on the format. The speakers each will be giving remarks for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll engage in a panel conversation. I'll ask them a couple of questions, and then we will turn to the Q&A. So just to repeat on the questions, you can start putting the questions in right away, audience members. Please feel free to just start asking them right now, but do put your name and affiliation, and we'll get to them in the end. So without further ado, let me invite Derek Grossman for his views.
Thank you for that. And good morning to everybody from Santa Monica, California, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are now. Thank you for attending, and I want to take an opportunity to thank the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University for inviting me to speak today and for putting together such a timely and important discussion. So I've been asked to address U.S. defense strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan, but before I do that, and because I'm going first, it's worth taking a moment to consider the recent context in the Taiwan Strait. And I'm sure my colleagues will amplify my thoughts during their presentations. But here are just some brief thoughts from me. So as I'm sure we're all painfully aware, since Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's election in January 2016, China has systematically ramped up diplomatic, economic, and military pressure against the island. I think the Biden administration has really surprised many observers, including myself, in how forward-leaning it has been in defending Taiwan's sovereignty in the face of China's increasingly coercive behavior. For example, the Biden administration has retained and put into action the Trump administration's decision to end self-imposed limits on contact with Taiwan. Secretary of State Tony Blinken has noted that the Biden administration wants to, quote, make sure that we're acting pursuant to the mandate in the Taiwan Assurance Act that looks at creating more space for contacts. Taking advantage of the upgraded contact guidelines, the Biden administration surprised everyone by inviting for the first time ever, for the first time since 1979, Taiwan's de facto ambassador, Madam Bi-khim Hsiao, to attend the inauguration ceremony. During Japanese Prime Minister Suga's visit to the White House last month, Taiwan was specifically raised as a point of concern among the allies. Yet another tangible example of how the Biden administration has been socializing the need to defend Taiwan, or at least talk publicly about the need to enhance, or at least talk about Taiwan publicly to enhance deterrence as it strengthens alliances and partnerships throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Just last week, the Biden administration, in conjunction with the G7, issued a statement of support for Taiwanese participation in the World Health Organization and the World Health Assembly. There are many other examples of the Biden administration's forward-leaning approach to Taiwan, which, as I have written about, is really a quiet continuation of the Trump administration's policies. And I'm sure my colleagues will cover them at greater length. But in the interest of time, I'll now turn to U.S. defense strategy for Taiwan. I think because we're in the early days of the Biden administration, we just passed 100 days, right? It's perhaps too early to decipher specifics on U.S. defense strategy. However, at the broadest of levels, one thing is for sure. The U.S. plans to defend Taiwan if attacked by China. This is significant because, frankly, under the Trump administration, it wasn't as clear as it is today. Indeed, the Trump administration was very focused on defense of Taiwan, but President Trump himself perhaps was not as inclined. When asked last month by Chuck Todd on Meet the Press whether the U.S. was militarily prepared to defend Taiwan, Secretary Blinken said, quote, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. All I can tell you is we have a serious commitment to Taiwan being able to defend itself. We have a serious commitment to peace and security in the Western Pacific. And in that context, it would be a serious mistake for anyone to try to change that status quo by force, end quote. So the Biden administration has also addressed head-on one of the most visible security threats to Taiwan in recent months, that of rising numbers of Chinese warplanes entering Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. In January, during the Biden administration, the State Department released a statement condemning Beijing's aggressive behavior, noting that, quote, our commitment to Taiwan is rock solid and contributes to the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and within the region. There are other positive statements to this point as well. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has said that China represents, quote unquote, the pacing threat for the entire Pentagon. His team is currently undergoing an internal review of China defense strategy. Meanwhile, Deputy Secretary of Defense Dr. Kathleen Hicks, in Senate testimony, remarked that the U.S. should be, quote, crystal clear regarding its defense commitments to Taiwan and providing the island with the necessary defensive equipment. The Biden administration has so far matched its words with action. For example, the U.S. has transited the Taiwan Strait with warships at least 4 times since Biden's inauguration to deter Beijing. I haven't looked into it that deeply, but I presume that this is a record, and if not, it's at least on a record-setting pace for U.S. warship transits through the Taiwan Strait. Furthermore, there is word of a forthcoming arms sale under the Biden administration. I think we'll get more specifics on the Biden team's defense strategy for Taiwan once the China review at the Pentagon is completed. That said, there are already some clues that are worth noting. Last week, Secretary Austin penned an op-ed in the Washington Post in which he noted that the U.S. military will engage in quote-unquote integrated deterrence. Austin defines integrated deterrence as a way to, quote, buttress U.S. diplomacy and advance foreign policy that employs all instruments of our national power. He went on to state that integrated deterrence means using some of our, and this is a direct quote, means using some of our current capabilities differently. It means developing new operational concepts for things we already have, end quote. For the purposes of defending Taiwan, I think we have to read between the lines a bit and infer some things. Starting in 2017, Taiwan overhauled its own defense strategy. Rather than stopping Chinese forces from crossing the strait, Taiwan now assesses that Chinese capabilities and operational expertise are too substantial to achieve this mission. Instead, Taiwan has decided that it is best served if it saves its resources and lives to fight closer to Taiwan's littorals and on the beaches if necessary. This new Taiwan strategy, known as the Overall Defense Concept, or ODC, prioritizes the development and procurement of asymmetric technologies such as anti-ship cruise missiles and sea mines, many other things that can help defeat Chinese forces just before they transition from naval to amphibious landing operations on Taiwan. Washington is probably considering how best to plug into this new Taiwan defensive strategy. Secretary Austin understands that Chinese counter-intervention capabilities against the U.S. are improving every day, and therefore it is imperative that the U.S. find ways to maintain an edge while pushing farther back from the future theater of operations. As my home organization, RAND Corporation, has noted, U.S. bases in Asia in places like Okinawa and Guam are increasingly within range of Chinese ballistic missiles and other means of attack. So when Austin talks about developing new operational concepts and using the same capabilities differently, I think he's asking the China review team, how does the U.S. military remain potent and relevant in the fight as China's military becomes more capable of conquering or inflicting serious damage against Taiwan? And all the while, China is trying to complicate or even prevent U.S. intervention in such a conflict. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers, and we'll have to see what the Biden team comes up with. In my view, bolstering Taiwan's overall defense concept is probably the best option because it plays to the island's strengths and preserves Taiwan's conventional weaponry for a time when it can be used most effectively. I'll give an example. Taiwan has dozens of F-16s, but these F-16s likely won't be useful in the run-up to the amphibious landing since China will blow up runways. Why not save them for when Chinese missiles are already expended and Chinese forces are weakened by asymmetrical attrition? One strong indication of where the Biden administration will be heading with its defensive strategy for Taiwan will be arms sales. Most recently, under the Trump administration, arms sales reached a record number of 11 in 4 years. But frankly, these packages were pretty schizophrenic in their aim. On the one hand, the Trump administration sold asymmetric technologies like anti-ship cruise missiles to Taiwan. They sold the Harpoon as a good example. On the other hand, the Trump administration also sold 66 F-16Vs, once again underscoring the conventional military priorities involved in defending Taiwan. The Trump administration has even sold HIMARS and SLAM-ER. HIMARS is the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, and SLAM-ER is a standoff land attack missile expanded response. And both of those systems are considered offensive systems against the mainland. So Taiwan arms sales have really kind of been all over the place. So the types of weapon systems that the Biden administration decides to sell will be particularly telling. Finally, we'll have to learn together whether integrated deterrence prioritizes deterrence by denial or something else. Deterrence by denial is the classic case of making it very painful for China to attempt taking over or attacking Taiwan. It'll essentially rely on enhancing Taiwan's own anti-access area denial or A2AD capabilities. There are, however, other forms of deterrence. For example, one is cost imposition. Secretary Austin's op-ed seemed to suggest that the US might strike at Chinese interests elsewhere if Beijing decided to strike Taiwan. He says in the op-ed, quote, "Any adversary thinking about pressing for advantage in one domain must know that we can respond not just in that arena, but in many others as well. The power to deter rests on our ability to respond to aggression in the time and manner of our choosing," end quote. So getting a better sense of these types of things will be important going forward. So I look forward to your questions and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Derek, for that comprehensive and very timely presentation about what we're facing right now and what you're seeing. Let me now turn to a different sphere in economics and see what's happening there. There's also, Biden has been very, very active on that front as well, even vis-a-vis Taiwan, including trade agreements. So let me turn it over to you, Barbara.
Thanks, Professor Ollapally, and thanks to GW and the Sigur Center for inviting me to join today's panel to discuss trade and the economic pillar of U.S.-Taiwan relations. And I think it's a real opportunity to talk about this because the economic and trade relationship has significant potential for growth, but in these discussions, because of everything else going on, it often gets short shrift. So let me cover 3 items. The first thing I'd like to do is discuss the current state of the trade relationship and how it's fared through growing U.S.-China trade tensions and through COVID. I'd like to then address the calls in both the U.S. and Taiwan for deepening economic ties, and particularly calls to launch an FTA negotiation and the likely Biden administration response. And finally, beyond an FTA, I'd like to discuss other initiatives that the U.S. and Taiwan might consider to deepen their trade and investment relationship. So let me start with level setting on the current state of play in the trade relationship. And I don't want to overwhelm people with numbers because we're not doing slides here. So I'm going to try to limit the number of data points that I give, but I think you need to go through a few of the numbers to get a sense of the importance of the relationship. So just in terms of size, two-way trade totaled $106 billion last year. Most of that was in goods trade. Taiwan exported $60 billion in goods to the United States last year, and the United States was its second largest goods export market after China. which was, of course, the destination for 40% of its exports. As a footnote to the goods trade, I just want to note that the Congressional Research Service has pointed out in its publications that these figures do not count Taiwan firms that manufacture in China for export to the U.S. market. So in some ways, I mean, not according to trade data, but in some ways you could think of them as undervaluing or undercounting the value of the relationship. Meanwhile, Taiwan was the 9th largest trading partner, goods trading partner for the United States, and that was up a notch from the previous year when it was 10th, and exports totaled $31 billion. So quite a bit more coming from Taiwan to the U.S. than the other way around. What do we sell to each other? Well, the U.S. sells capital goods, intermediate goods, raw materials, mostly machinery, electrical machinery, fuel, optical and medical instruments, and aircraft. The U.S. also exported more than $3 billion in agricultural products to Taiwan last year, and Taiwan was the U.S.'s 8th largest agricultural market. The U.S. also sold $9 billion in services, so that's also a large market. Coming the other way, Taiwan sold to the United States mostly also capital goods, intermediate goods, and this included electrical machinery and also vehicles, iron and steel products, and plastics. Of all of these, about half, no surprise, is comprised of semiconductors, computer accessories and computers, as well as telecom equipment. That's the trade is very heavily weighted on those products. I think it's also important to note that investment between the U.S. and Taiwan is a significant part of the economic relationship. FDI numbers lag, so we have numbers only going to 2019, but the stock of U.S. foreign direct investment in Taiwan in 2019 was $17.4 billion, and Taiwan's foreign direct investment in the United States was $11 billion. So both a sizable amount in both directions. So clearly the relationship is already strong, and it seems likely only to grow in the coming years. There are a lot of reasons for this. One is Taiwan's efforts to lessen its heavy reliance on the Chinese market and to diversify its trade partners. These efforts, of course, have been underway for a long time, but they've intensified with the growing U.S.-China trade tensions and also as a result of the impact of COVID. From the U.S. side, Taiwan was often seen as a key link in its high-tech supply chains, but its role has become even more critical as companies have sought themselves to diversify away from China and to find new trusted partners. As the largest manufacturer of sophisticated semiconductors, Taiwan plays an especially vital role for U.S. companies. And this is not only in the IT industry that people think of, but across a broad range of almost every other industry that you can think of because of semiconductors. And the relationship there is complementary and, in fact, I think symbiotic. So given the growing importance of the trade relationship and the shifting political and strategic environment, it's no surprise that calls for a launch of U.S.-Taiwan FTA negotiations have grown increasingly louder over the past few years. In the United States, you've heard much from Congress, which has been an active supporter of strengthening U.S.-Taiwan relations for a long time, but it also is pushing the Biden administration and before that pushed the Trump administration to pursue an FTA. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Strategic Competition Act that was unveiled last month, bipartisan legislation laying out a broad strategic approach for dealing with China, has in it many provisions for strengthening U.S. economic cooperation with Taiwan and other regional partners. In March, 23 members of Congress sent a letter to President Biden urging him to pursue an FTA with Taiwan. And of course, this was just the latest in a periodic push by members of Congress to launch FTA negotiations. In fact, a year earlier, a bipartisan group of 161 members sent a letter to USTR calling for them to begin bilateral trade FTA negotiations. So congressional interest continues to grow. And in December, Senator Toomey introduced a resolution expressing the sense of the Senate that the U.S. should begin FTA negotiations with Taiwan, noting the importance of the commercial and cultural relations and its critical role in global supply chains during COVID and other, more broader strategic benefits. Taiwan has also pushed for an FTA. Its interest stems not only from the growing regional tensions and efforts to diversify, but also more recently concerns about the implications of being left out of both the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which concluded late last year, and the CPTPP, which is the agreement that succeeded TPP when the U.S. pulled out. And let me just stop for a minute to say, for folks who aren't following these trade negotiations in the region, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is a Asia-wide trade agreement that includes the 10 ASEAN countries, as well as China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand in one large Asia trade agreement that will go into force likely at the beginning of next year. And this is living side by side with the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, that is the agreement among the 11 countries that remained in TPP after the United States withdrew. So both of those exist, and Taiwan is not a member of either of those agreements, nor is the U.S. for that matter. So I think for those reasons as well, Taiwan would like to see a free trade agreement emerge with the United States. And it sought to interest the United States in moving forward for a while now. Last August, when then HHS Secretary Azar visited Taiwan, President Tsai took the opportunity to raise Taiwan's interest in an FTA, and she noted the importance of economic linkages and supply chain security for both the United States and Taiwan, but lamented at that time that closer trade relations had been hindered by what she called technicalities that account for a small fraction of bilateral trade. And what she meant by technicalities were the bilateral frictions over beef and pork, which were longstanding and had prevented access for those products to the Taiwan market. USTR responded to her comments by saying that the U.S. wanted closer ties, but Taiwan's quarantine requirements for beef and pork stood in the way. So then, in a very surprising move, after such a long-standing irritant, Taiwan in August, shortly after that visit, said that it would lift in January, as in January this year, restrictions on U.S. pork and beef and allow imports as of the beginning of this year. But USTR still remained silent on that announcement, and it made no public comment. Some had tried to read into the lack of comment by USTR the suggestion that, they thought, well, Taiwan didn't actually fix the beef and pork issue fully, and that there wouldn't be further comment from USTR until they saw what Taiwan did. Others read the USTR reaction to mean that it was very focused on ensuring that nothing interfered with China's implementation of the Phase 1 deal purchase agreements. And so it did not want to engage with Taiwan while it was focused on that aspect of U.S.-China relations. U.S. chair was silent, so we don't actually know what the reasoning was. But the State Department was more enthusiastic than the USTR on the Taiwan's move. And then Undersecretary Stilwell gave a speech last August welcoming the move on beef and pork and other issues. And he said to further build momentum in the relationship, the U.S. and Taiwan would establish a new bilateral economic dialogue. And that dialogue was intended to explore the full spectrum of the economic relationship. The issues listed were semiconductors, healthcare, energy, and beyond. But the announcement from Stilwell came too late in the Trump administration for any outcomes to be achieved. So now, following the election and President Biden's inauguration, Taiwan still seems to be hopeful about deepening cooperation with the U.S. Taiwan Minister John Deng said that the government was under no illusions that it can quickly sign an FTA with the United States, but when the time was right, success would flow naturally. My view is somewhat less sanguine. I see many opportunities for cooperation, but I don't see a high likelihood of launching FTA negotiations in the foreseeable future. And there are a number of reasons for this, quite apart from any strategic considerations. The first is that the Biden administration has been absolutely clear that trade agreements are not where it intends to focus its near-term energies, despite the efforts of other countries to conclude new trade agreements. Given the urgency of dealing with COVID and climate change and the focus on domestic infrastructure and other domestic policies, it's hard to see trade moving up the administration's list of priorities. Second, even if the administration decides that it wants to rethink its approach and look at new trade agreements, it's not at all clear that it will decide it wants to negotiate bilateral trade agreements. It may prefer to negotiate sectoral agreements on specific products or sectors, or it may prefer to pursue a regional approach and build on TPP or some other regional set of issues, which would be probably faster than going at a bilateral approach. So I think there's a question there. And third, and I think most immediately, is the expiration of Trade Promotion Authority, or what used to be known as Fast Track Authority. The current TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, expires on July 1st. And in order to negotiate a new agreement, many believe, and I'm one of them, that the administration would need new Trade Promotion Authority. Now, just a digression for a second for people, again, who don't follow this. Under the Constitution, Congress has the authority for negotiating trade agreements, but it delegates that authority temporarily for some set period of time to the executive branch, provided it meets congressionally mandated negotiating requirements, both on substance and process. And if the administration meets those requirements, and Congress, when it has to vote to ratify the trade agreement, can only vote up or down on the agreement. It can't amend the agreement. So, absent TPA, the United States would be negotiating an agreement that Congress could amend any provision of that agreement. And I think it's very difficult to imagine Taiwan or any trading partner wanting to engage in an extended negotiation with the United States without being clear that there's consensus domestically in the United States about what should be in a new trade agreement, and that agreement is likely to be ratified. So for all those reasons, I'm not holding my breath that there will be an announcement on the launch of an FTA anytime soon. But there are other approaches to developing the economic partnership. While an FTA would be one way, we need to move beyond this binary debate about whether to pursue an FTA as though it's the only way to strengthen economic relations, or that going ahead is some sort of barometer about the value that the two put on their economic relationship. There's clearly strong Biden administration interest in deepening relations. There's bipartisan support for Taiwan in Congress. And so the U.S. and Taiwan have the opportunity to launch initiatives in many areas of common interest should they decide to do so. There actually already are several work streams under which trade and trade-related work could proceed. In terms of process, I think the work streams should continue separately, but in parallel, and work in a coordinated fashion. And the reason for this is because I think setting up a new, big, formal, high-profile dialogue might get a lot of initial press, but it would probably make less progress than continuing on with work streams that are more nimble and might allow for more immediate and meaningful outcomes quickly. On substance, there seem to be at least 3 work streams worth pursuing. One is led by USTR, and that is the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, or a TIFA. And the TIFA between the U.S. and Taiwan was signed in 1994, and it is really just a mechanism for trade dialogue. And the two sides meet regularly just to discuss trade issues. They have discussed trade relations, specific trade irritants, and ways to work through those, and those should continue. But there were no meetings under the TIFA at all during the Trump administration. In fact, the last meeting was held in 2016 before the end of the Obama administration. I think that these meetings should continue. The meetings established a regular channel of communication between the U.S. and Taiwan at all levels, and it built relationships of trust between the two sides and established an ongoing agenda. Resuming them would advance a number of goals. That they could meet for regular policy consultation to address bilateral issues and irritants, and the list of those is rather long if anybody has seen the national trade estimate that came out in March. They also could use the meeting to promote policy alignment and coordinate their respective agendas and positions in APEC and the WTO and other organizations. And finally, they could use the meeting to develop and launch new bilateral initiatives that can move ahead regardless of the direction that the Biden administration takes on negotiating trade agreements. With the focus on COVID recovery, they could discuss trips. They could also negotiate an arrangement on digital trade. Another work stream could be led by the State Department, and that could continue work under the U.S.-Taiwan bilateral economic prosperity dialogue, where there's a lot of relevant work on issues like 5G, telecom supply chains, and other areas. And an obvious area for cooperation here would be on semiconductors. And we can come back to that. I see I'm running late. Let me go to, and then I think a third work stream should be led by the Commerce Department, which has responsibility for some work on supply chains, but also on standards, and it could use that to shape priorities between the U.S. and Taiwan on technology standards. They also could be working on trade promotion and efforts bilaterally on trade promotion, but also in third countries. So let me summarize, because I think I'm out of time, that there are clearly many areas ripe for cooperation between the U.S. and Taiwan. We need to move past the question of whether to launch an FTA negotiation and look at other areas where work could be done and that would be mutually beneficial. Thanks, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you for that very clear-eyed assessment of the trade relations, spoken by someone who knows what the on-the-ground realities are. And now I'm going to ask my colleague Bob to sort of step back a little bit and look at the overarching framework on U.S.-Taiwan relations and how it fits in the broader U.S. foreign policy strategy. Bob. Oh, and one more thing. Excuse me. One thing I wanted to tell the audience. I see a lot of questions coming in, but you're not giving your affiliation and title. So if you would just give your affiliation, we'll really appreciate that. We'd like to know who is asking the questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Deepa. It's really a pleasure to address the group. I really appreciate the previous two presentations because they cover a lot of ground that I was intending to cover. And they just underline the fact that the Biden government is following a path that the Trump government followed, and so we're really in a very different period. And so I'm looking at where are we going in this relationship, and I'm going to look at the status and implications of the Biden policy and this broader trend that's been going on now for about 4 years. Of shifting of ever stronger U.S. support for Taiwan, even though Beijing objects. This continues to go on. And so I'm going to focus on this, and what I see is a weakening of the whole one China policy. It's certainly the strict interpretation of the one China policy is obsolete, as we've seen, and yet that was the common way of looking at this in the past. And so where are we with this? And what I'm going to examine is the determinants of the one China policy and how they are changed in a significant way, in a broad sense, given the fact that now we have this new administration and they're doing pretty much the same thing that the previous administration did, giving a very high profile to Taiwan, strong support for Taiwan, and so forth. And what I'm going to say is that I'm going to examine this change and say this has momentum. This is going to continue, and the main break in this situation is China and the power of China. And analysts are well aware of this, and many of them warn this is a very tense situation. The U.S. keeps pushing ahead with Taiwan. And Beijing is more and more concerned about this, and they're very powerful. And so the bottom line here is then what does this mean? How this is very tense, and what should be done? And I'm going to argue here that there are some counter trends, some other interests that Beijing has that reduce the danger of this tension to some degree. And then I will make some comments at the end about the continued utility of the one China policy. So I have some talking points which I've prepared. I'm happy to share them with you if you don't already have them. But I'll just send me an email on that. We can get them to you. Okay. My introductory point is that this is the most significant change the United States has done in its relations with Taiwan since the establishment of relations with the PRC. No question about it. And this has been going on now for 4 years. And just a few points. Derek talked about the security profile of the Biden government, how they give a strong security profile to Taiwan, and what the U.S. but the Biden people are doing in the South China Sea, right nearby, is emblematic of this type of change. It's very critical of China, very forward-leaning in dealing with the issues with China. So I think we can expect a lot more of this. And we've talked about the high-profile support diplomatically for Taiwan. And on the economic side, I think Barbara talked about this very well. I would just add that there's an acute desire to have a stronger relationship with the high-technology industries of Taiwan. This is a new thing, and it gets a new emphasis, just adds to the momentum that the U.S. has in this regard. And so my point is, in looking at this continuation, this is a very sharp turn away from the strict one China policy that prevailed in U.S. policy most of the time through the Obama administration. Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, they were all part of this strict interpretation of the one China policy. They have changed. They have moved in a very different direction. And the momentum behind this is important to understand. I'm going to describe that in just a minute. And I think, but I do think that this is challenging many of the assumptions of and the determinants of the one China policy. And so, are we going to go beyond the one China policy? Is the basic question. And I think that's something that we have that can be considered now, given the nature of these changes that are underway. Okay. Why and how have the determinants of the U.S. one China policy changed? And I'm going to look at drivers and I'm going to look at brakes. And the big driver is Beijing. China's growing determination to expand its wealth and power at others' expense as its economic and military capacities advance China's influence and control in Asia and the world is the main driver as far as U.S. policy is concerned. China's drive is broadly seen by bipartisan majorities in Congress and elsewhere in Washington as posing a series of serious challenges to America. If not met effectively, these will lead to substantial erosion of U.S. power and influence relative to China. The stakes are high in this situation. The risks of Chinese dominance in Asia and in high technology industries and an international order detrimental not only to narrow U.S. national interests, but also to regional and global free economic interchange, national independence, popular sovereignty, and personal freedom. All of these are at stake. So this is very powerful force. This underlines why we have shifted this U.S.-China policy so much over the last 4 years. Now, looking at the case of Taiwan, this Chinese practice involves a multifaceted military, diplomatic, and economic pressures on Taiwan to change the status quo there in China's favor. And what we find is that U.S. policy now works vigorously to push back and sustain the status quo. 2, Taiwan's key location, its role in the Indo-Pacific region, and its strong position amid an acute U.S.-China competition over high technology industries of the future are important elements valued by U.S. policymakers seeking to compete with and counter adverse Chinese advances. Number 3, Taiwan's political democracy, free market economy, and support for international norms America seeks to advance are valued by U.S. leaders opposed to expanding authoritarian rule such as that of China. And finally, U.S. relations with Taiwan provide leverage for U.S. policymakers seeking to impose costs or otherwise influence PRC behavior. These are the key things that drive the United States forward in its relationship with Taiwan, trying to counter this Beijing's approach. But in the past, the one China policy, the strict interpretation of it, was driven not just by these the relatively weak drivers of moving ahead with Taiwan, but also by these breaks. And there were several breaks that were very important that I'd like to talk about in particular that made the U.S. government of the past reluctant to antagonize Beijing. The first one has to do with a worry that the advances with Taiwan would upset the overall U.S. relationship with China. Mr. Trump just made that overtaken by events, and it continues in the Biden administration. This concern with the relationship with China is not very high anymore. It's not really an obstacle, a serious obstacle in moving forward. Well, it's not a major obstacle in moving forward with Taiwan. By the same token, another break was that the U.S. didn't want to upset the countries in the region who didn't want to see a disruption in U.S.-China relations over Taiwan. Well, those relationships have been disrupted. U.S.-China relations are very disrupted. And so the result, that's been overtaken by events as well. A third break was the concern in the United States that moving forward with Taiwan would prompt leaders in Taiwan to take advantage of this situation for domestic political reasons or other reasons. Chen Shui-bian, the former president of Taiwan, was a case in point. Tsai Ing-wen is not like Chen Shui-bian, a very deliberative, very steady leader, and the Americans seem to have a lot of confidence in this leadership, that they won't do this sort of thing. So this leads us to the outlook. Where are we going in this type of situation? And it seems that we are focused now on the main break and forward U.S. movement to Taiwan. That remains. It was important in the past, and it's important now. Beijing. Beijing's power, economic power, political power, but particularly its military power. This is something that if you push too far, you may lead to a crisis with Beijing, a military crisis. And so how important is this? And will it block the situation? What it does lead to is obviously a tense situation in the Taiwan Straits. This is widely seen as dangerous by many different experts. And analysts predict increasing danger as rising Chinese military power capacities appear to outpace American military strength, changing the overall balance of power to the advantage of China. Derek may want to weigh in on this in the question and answer session, but he addressed this issue in his presentation. And so this is a very serious matter. Is this getting out of control? I don't think so. And here's why I think this way. I have two basic reasons for this. The first one is that China has clearly demonstrated reluctance to confront America in ways that would lead to military conflict. Let's look at the record over the recent years. Look at how they treated Donald Trump. They didn't confront him, and they didn't confront America militarily during that administrations. Why? The reasons includes the adverse impact this would have on many internal priorities of China. It would also impact its still strong economic dependence on the United States, and it would be risky for China given the vulnerabilities of China along the rim of Asia and in the control of important sea lines of communication. These are fundamental reasons why the Chinese don't confront America. Now, obviously, deterring China from attacking Taiwan may be more difficult as the balance of forces in the Taiwan Strait continue to change in Beijing's favor. That U.S. forces can no longer guarantee a quick victory over Chinese attack is important. But the United States and its allies in the Cold War were able to deter successfully major asymmetries in military capacities in Europe vis-a-vis the very powerful conventional forces of the Soviet Union. And they can presumably figure out different ways to do this in the case of Taiwan today. Another point that doesn't get enough attention, it seems to me, a more immediately relevant countervailing factor is Beijing's effort to slow or reverse the overall hardening of America's resolve to resist Chinese challenges. China seeks to avoid a cutoff of U.S. economic, high technology, and other interchange with the United States that is needed and advantageous for China's development. The U.S. focusing the spotlight on China's aggression against Taiwan could further energize calls for American resistance. This would seriously curb the many advantages China gets from economic, technology, and other U.S. interchange. This also would reduce the influence of U.S. businesses and other interests in sustaining involvement with China, advantageous for these companies and organizations, but increasingly seen as adverse to overall U.S. national security. I think the Chinese understand this. Chinese administration understands this. And they don't want this to happen if they don't have to take drastic action in this regard. So those are my views of the tension in the relationship. Those are my views of how the relationship is changing, how we are continuing down the path that began in the Trump government. Will continue. It's been done incrementally. It hasn't been done in a dramatic way. But it's continuing. And but it does raise the issue: is the one China policy obsolete? And I think in this case, I would advise keeping the one China policy because it would avoid possible crisis and major disruption caused by ending it. Any sort of declaration in this regard. And it would allow for the continued, recent, steady, and incremental steps that solidified Taiwan's relationship with the United States under a broad and flexible interpretation of the U.S. one China policy. And this is likely to take a while. And so looking out in the future, I think this would be a good path to take. So I will stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Bob, for those very illuminating overview statements and on immediate and longer term things that we have to think about. I'm going to take just a few minutes, maybe about 5 minutes or so, to engage in a few questions that I want to ask the panelists. We are getting quite a few questions. A lot of them are on the defense arena and the kind of controversies going on right now, but also some on economics. But let me just start, let me go back to Derek and link up with something that Bob just mentioned. And that is the idea that, you look at the shifting balance of power in the Taiwan Strait going in favor of China. Bob mentioned one countervailing factor to keep things under the kind of a high level of threshold of conflict is that China is making certain type of cost benefit analysis that suggests that doing more might harden the US resolve. And so the question is, do you think that China is engaging in that kind of cost benefit analysis? And number two, recently James Sebens has written an article about how China's use of, US's use of force, short of sort of war, but use of force has actually decreased the chance of Chinese aggression rather than increased, as some might argue. So two different things, but somewhat connected to the way China thinks about these risks.
Yeah, I mean, to your first point, I mean, I think China is constantly calculating and recalculating what's going on in the strait, right? And it's not just vis-a-vis the United States, but of course vis-a-vis Taiwan, right? I mean, they obviously do not trust Tsai Ing-wen as far as they can throw her. I mean, from the very beginning, I mean, this is before she was even elected in January 2016. They viewed her as integral to Li Denghui's state-to-state approach to relations between China and Taiwan back in the late 90s. They have called her a closet independence supporter. And by the way, they also if they don't trust her, they don't trust her vice president even more so. And that's Lai Ching-te, or William Lai, who was her, is obviously her vice president, but also ran against her in the DPP primary last time, the Democratic Progressive primary, Democratic Progressive Party primary. And the word that I've been hearing is that William Lai is most likely to have the Tsai is likely to pass the baton to William Lai for 2024. And William Lai has said in the past that he is a pro-independence worker for Taiwan. All right, so no more closet independence supporting. This may be, out of the closet, overt independence supporting, and we'll see what happens with that. So I think China is constantly keeping tabs on all of these different maneuvers and then kind of reconsidering its strategy from there. But the overarching goal, of course, from Chinese President Xi Jinping is the People's Liberation Army needs to become competent enough to successfully conduct an amphibious landing invasion against Taiwan. If you go back and look at his 19th Party Congress speech in October 2017, he said that he wanted the PLA modernization to, quote unquote, be basically completed, basically modernized by 2035. And most observers, including at my home organization at RAND, interpret that to mean to fight and win a war within the first island chain. And of course, Taiwan is part of that first island chain. Farther out, into 2050, Xi Jinping said that he wanted the PLA to become a world-class force. So, a little bit more nebulous what exactly that means. Does that mean on par with the United States, surpassing the United States? We'll see. But at least out to 2035, that's sort of been the marker that the PLA can successfully conduct that amphibious landing. We've heard a lot in recent weeks. I mean, Admiral Davidson from Indo-PACOM, who just retired, in testimony to Congress, had talked about the next 6 years being really important. So if you do the math, we're in 2021, 2027, it would be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PLA. And so there are some folks who think that that signifies the marker of, being able to successfully conquer Taiwan, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of churn right now about this. I personally think it's still 2035 because that's what Xi Jinping had mentioned in the 19th Party Congress speech. And then your second question, I'm sorry, was about...
Yeah, I'm going, in the interest of time,
That's fine.
I think there are some questions that are related to what I was going to ask, so I'll leave that. And I do just quickly want to ask a point from Barbara, who, again, I had something about supply chain vulnerabilities, but I see questions on that, so I'll come back to that, Barbara. But before that, my question to you is, having seen now that the US and Taiwan and India also, I should add, are out of RCEP and CTPP, two big groups that are going to be setting standards for products, for labor, for environment, and so on. How worried are you that that having US and Taiwan out of these big groupings that are going to set the rules of engagement in trade and economics down the road in the future, that this is not, that's a very, not a good trend? And what can they do about it?
Well, as a person who spent 10 years negotiating the TPP, I obviously think that it was in our interest to be part of that regional negotiation and to be at the table setting the rules and enforcing the rules. And we're now out of it, and Taiwan is out of it, and India is also, as you mentioned, not in any of these trade agreements. I mean, I think that the agreements vary in terms of their impact on Taiwan and even the United States. The RCEP has very liberal rules of origin for the way that preferential treatment and access would be counted and calculated. So the immediate impact may be somewhat less significant than one would fear, although I do think it matters that they're out of the agreement. And similarly on TPP, but the TPP agreement has stronger rules of origin that would affect Taiwan and the United States. So I think that the fact that we're not in the agreement has two aspects that are of concern. One is on market access and the way supply chains will evolve as a result. And the second is on rules. The rules in TPP were carried over to the CPTPP. So they largely reflect the U.S. view of how those rules should be set, and therefore, at least for the time being, seem to be strong. But without the U.S. there to enforce, I think that there will be less serious enforcement of those rules. Over time, I think you're right, it absolutely does matter. It's going to have an impact on the way that the region develops and our role in it. And I think it should cause serious reflection on the part of U.S. policymakers as to how we're going to remain engaged in a serious way in the region, but also for Taiwan to find other ways that it can engage if it can't participate directly in any of these trade agreements.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara. And finally, Bob, just to step back even further, looking at the way the administration is shaping its overarching foreign policy, norms seem to be very important, meaning that the global contest between authoritarianism and democracy is kind of shaping up to be one big theme in the Biden administration's foreign policy. And so we know Taiwan is a vibrant democracy, not new, but in this increasingly tight global competition, which now is including this element in a front and center, with sanctions and so forth that they're doling out. How do you see Taiwan playing out in that aspect in kind of specific ways, if you can think of any ways that it might?
Yeah, on the specific side, I haven't given a lot of thought to this. I think you see an awful lot of collaboration between the State Department and Taiwan on a whole range of issues. We've gotten to the point where State Department envoys, when they go to places in Latin America, they bring Taiwan people with them. They're like our partners in this type of situation because they have these values. So yes, I think it's a big attraction to the U.S. government. This kind of a U.S. government, as you say, emphasizes this competition with authoritarians. And Taiwan and the values of Taiwan's government and what they stand for and what they practice is just very much in line with what the United States likes. And so I think that's going forward. I just see more of this kind of effort, and I think the only restraint is what Beijing might do in reaction to it. And so if you do it by step, and then I think you can do it without major blow up with Beijing.
All right, thank you. And now on to the questions from the audience. Thank you for your patience. We have plenty of time still to get to most of them. I'm going to start with a question from Tina Chung, who's a reporter for the Voice of America, who is directing her questions at Bob and Derek in this case. It's a defense question. Her question is taking up something that many of you might know, have read in the New York Times, a journalism professor criticizing the Biden administration's approach to Taiwan, basically suggesting that that doing things like inviting the Taiwan representative to the inauguration and making certain statements of rock solid commitment to Taiwan is, quote, truly and deeply reckless because it's undermining the U.S. One China policy. And that also in this article, that apparently in every war game that the Pentagon has conducted on China and Taiwan, the American side has lost every time because it doesn't have enough capability to deter it. So how do you view this kind of an assessment? Let me, perhaps Derek and then Bob.
Yeah, I think I know the New York Times op-ed you're referring to. There have been a lot of controversial ones recently, not just in the New York Times, but elsewhere. You know, on the war game issue, I mean, I'm at RAND, we do a lot of war gaming. I mean, a big part of the reason why we war game is to figure out some of the difficult challenges that remain for the US military to deal with against any adversary, not just China, right? And so a lot of times, yes, the United States does lose the war game, but it's because we make the adversary do certain things that maybe the adversary wouldn't necessarily do. So we're constantly challenging the blue side of the house, the United States military, to do better against the red or the adversary. So, I mean, take it with a grain of salt on the wargaming part, but the fact remains that China's power projection capabilities in the Strait and well beyond are dramatically increasing and improving. And so that is definitely something that we have to be concerned about. And then the first point on what was that first point on Taiwan policy again? That it's destabilizing,
Is
right?
it reckless and destabilizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to Bob's point that, I mean, the U.S. China keeps pushing the envelope in the Strait. They are increasingly coercive against Taiwan. So there's naturally going to be a response from the American side, but that response can certainly go too far, and that I think is something of concern. Yes.
Just on this question, another related one is whether or not you think there's an element of overestimating PLA military capabilities, a kind of a hype. Is there that?
I personally don't think we're overestimating PLA capabilities because we've seen a dramatic improvement, especially in the last 10 years, but over the last 20 years. That's not to say that if we fought a war today that we would lose. I think we would still win, but it would be a lot bloodier than it would have been, say, 10 years ago. And that is something to be concerned about. When you look back at the Cold War, we thought the Soviets were, you know, a million feet high, and as it turned out, they really weren't, right? That may be the case, 30, 40 years from now when we declassify a lot of our assessments, but right now it doesn't seem that that's the case.
Bob?
Yeah, Deepa, I'd like to make 2 points. First, on the reckless issue, I think my view is that the United States government sees itself in a acute competition with Beijing, challenged on all sorts of fronts, including Taiwan. And so yes, they're going to do things they're countering these challenges, and this is going to lead to a lot of tension. There's no question about that. And so the question is, so that's not reckless. That's trying to defend yourself against a threat, which I tried to point out is an extremely serious threat from the point of view of the people that are making this kind of a policy. So I think that we're in that stage. So the idea of nuance and so forth gets in the way of trying to counter this threat. And so Taiwan is a key element in the U.S. efforts to counter the threat. So that I think we're going to go forward with that kind of an approach. So that's the point I really wanted to make. But the other point is your question was on the issue of help me with that one.
On the issue of whether or not the war games, which I think
just one point on that. I think Derek might agree with this. I'm not sure. As National Intelligence Officer, I always had a much better fix on what China could do than I did about what America could do. We don't know.
Totally agree with that. Yeah.
And the Chinese don't know either. And so really look at the current reporting and say, oh, that's what America can do. No way. They're doing all sorts of things you hadn't even thought about. And so I'd be very cautious about that. And yet these balances are often done this way. And I think it's flawed. It's a flawed way to do it.
Thank you for that insight into U.S. military state of readiness. Okay. I'm going to ask one more question that I think is for the two of you, and then I have some for Barbara. So continuing on this, on the defense question and China, Taiwan, possibility of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. As you know, this is a question from Jeffrey Kuo. He's from GW and a student of economics. On March 1st, I think it was the Economist. So going from the New York Times now to the Economist, which had a front page cover calling Taiwan the most dangerous place on earth, right? And so I've also seen hashtag the most dangerous place on earth, but in a tongue-in-cheek way, where they're posting pictures, very peaceful, beautiful pictures of various spots of in Taiwan with people enjoying themselves in cafes and so on. But the question is, for Jeffrey, is whether you agree with that characterization. And I'd like to ask how would you respond to the editors of the Economist on this? Either one of you or Barbara.
I could jump in. I don't agree with it. I think the point was to, sell more magazines, to run with something a bit controversial. Look, could it become the most dangerous spot on the face of the earth? Of course, because China and the United States are both armed with nuclear weapons. And neither, as Bob has pointed out, neither is backing down over the issue of Taiwan. And so it could become the most dangerous spot. But right now, of course, it's not. You could point to Seoul in South Korea and say that that's the most dangerous spot on earth because North Korea could attack with nuclear weapons at any time. There are ongoing wars in Syria and in Libya and all over the world, Yemen, right, where we could say that's the most dangerous place right now. So I don't put much stock in it.
Bob, any thoughts?
I think Derek captured it. I think that's good.
Okay. All right. Barbara, I said that I'd come back to supply chains. And, one of the things that the Biden administration has done in the first 100 days is to do this big overview on where the supply chain vulnerabilities are. And the first 100 days, they looked at a lot of strategic technology areas. and supply chains along that, and of course, semiconductor industry, where Taiwan is such a critical player. And so there's a question here from David Edick, which asks, how extensive is U.S. dependence on chip manufacturing in Taiwan? What is the practical pathway for diversifying this exposure? But I guess the other question that I'd like to ask is, what's the relationship in chip manufacturing between Taiwan, US, and China? How is that? How is the vulnerabilities there? And what do you see as ways, the vulnerabilities, and how to get out of it?
Well, at the moment, the U.S. is very heavily dependent on chip manufacturers in Taiwan because they are the ones that are producing the most sophisticated chips. The result of that has been an effort on the part of China to accelerate the development of high-tech chip manufacturing in China. And I think for the U.S. to look at reshoring chip production in the United States, including by promoting investment by foreign firms in the United States. None of this is going to happen very quickly. All of these are going to take a long time to develop. And what you're seeing at the moment is chip shortages all over the world that are affecting a wide range of industries as a result. So I think that, part of the goal of the supply chain reviews was to look at the immediate impact of the interruption of these supply chains and then to look over time at what can be done. And so you will see some announcements, I assume, sometime in June after the initial reviews are over, and then at the end of the year-long review, more detailed reviews of what they want to do. But I think the idea being that there are a number of things that the United States wants to do, that China wants to do, and that Taiwan wants to do to ensure their competitiveness in this sector, and none of them are going to happen quickly.
What would you say, what are the cards that China holds on this in terms of slowing down the sort of diversification or move away from, the dependency and vulnerability?
Well, I think China showed its ability to use coercive tactics on countries, most recently Australia, but many other countries over time. And so to the extent that it feels that its supply chains are being affected by policies that Taiwan decides to pursue, I think that they have means to show their dismay and probably will not be reluctant to use them.
Okay. I know that the 5G competition is also heating up. I've seen that that's another arena here. But let me keep moving here. A student asked a question about the possibility of improving U.S. position by relying and pulling in its allies more closely to Taiwan's aid, and that one of them would be Japan. And so what is the possibility of that? How much is the U.S. Doing in terms of that? Bob, I think you mentioned the Japanese Prime Minister when he was here and the statements they made on Taiwan, but do you want to expand a little bit more on that?
Sure. Derek mentioned that one, Prime Minister Sugur's visit, and that's just one piece of evidence that shows that this administration is very interested in getting Japan to be more forward in working with them to deter China vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I think this is an ongoing process, and I'm not sure how far or fast it can go. The administration seems to value these relationship with allies and seems to be willing to compromise with allies, or at least to not pressure them to the point where they feel very uncomfortable in doing something. And so I would assume that you'll see slow steps as part of the Japanese, probably a lot more substance than anything public, to improve their capacity to be of support to the United States in the event of a Taiwan military face-off with Beijing. I think that's just an ongoing process in my judgment.
Derek, since you're the one who actually brought it up, can I ask you for any additional thoughts?
I mean, I think Bob's covered it sufficiently. I would just say that, the joint statement that came out when Prime Minister Suga visited the White House last month to include Taiwan was a really significant step for Japan, because obviously the US and Japan have been talking privately about Taiwan for many years, but to publicly talk about it is another thing. And so I think it underscores the increasing concern in Tokyo about what's going on in the Taiwan Strait.
Okay, let me take a question from a student, a GW, an MA student, Josh Luo. He wants to know the opinions from any of you on formally declaring strategic clarity as opposed to the post-1979 strategic ambiguity. Now, it seems to be moving in a particular way as I hear you all talk, but formally replace that. What do you think?
This is emblematic of if I could just interject briefly here, this is emblematic of the change in the fundamentals of the one China policy. If you do something like this, it seems to me you're really changing the fundamental one China policy. And I'm not sure you want to do that. Maybe it's because I've just lived with this one China policy framework for so long, and it's worked more or less effectively. And so I'd rather keep it going rather than risk this kind of dramatic step, which really substantively I don't think changes very much, but could be very disruptive because of it's a very public affront to Beijing. And so I just don't see the need to do this myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is coming about because, and I appreciate everything Bob said, it's worked in the past, but I think the question is now being raised because China is doing more coercively than it's ever done before to Taiwan. And the military balance of power in the Strait really is changing, not just vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also vis-a-vis the United States. And so there is, I think, a legitimate reason to wonder whether, moving from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity is the right move. I personally am against it, not because I think Beijing would be forced to respond, right? Beijing already knows that if it invades Taiwan, that we are coming to support Taiwan. Remember, I said in my remarks, maybe Trump himself didn't believe that, but the entire Trump administration did believe that, and I think they would have convinced the president against his own, thinking on it, right? But we now know with the Biden administration in strengthening alliances and partnerships and everything they've done to increase the stature of Taiwan, they are going to come to the support of Taiwan if China tries to militarily attack Taiwan, okay? So to me, it just sort of provides another opportunity for China to now complain and to, escalate, right? And it actually defeats the purpose of trying to provide that security to Taiwan.
Okay, there's a question that goes right to the heart of what you just said, Derek, and this comes from Priscilla Hoffman Stowe. She's retired from the State Department, Elliott School alum. She asks, how does greater support for Taiwan avoid war with China? Can we really deter China indefinitely? And that she doesn't see popular support in the US for a war to defend Taiwan. You just made a very different kind of point.
I mean, I think the public support in the United States is certainly questionable, right? Unfortunately, we've been through way too many wars in the last few years, and it's another war, right? Why should we be interested in what goes on over there? And there are many reasons I think the Biden administration would have to argue publicly as to why Taiwan is important to the United States and to U.S. security in particular, right? Not just Taiwan security. And so I think that that's something that would have to transpire if we ever got to that point.
Okay, we only have a couple of minutes, but I do want to take one question here from another student, Dea Lee, actually one of my students. His question is about the various measures that the PRC could possibly take, like the cyber campaigns against Taiwan. to adopt coercive mechanisms toward Taiwan. How possible is its occurrence, and what could Taiwan and the U.S. do to counter it? So how can they meet that challenge together against Taiwan? Who would like to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly no expert on cyber, so I think I'm gonna give no comment there.
All right. Okay. So here's a question that I think could be open to any of you. This is, if the Taiwan Relations Act were to be modified, what changes would the speakers recommend and why? It's a big question here, I admit. But if you have any quick thoughts on it.
I have a quick thought.
Okay.
Don't do it. Once you begin to open up the revising the Taiwan Relations Act, you're going to get a lot of pressure from Beijing, and I'm not sure what the result will be. So I'm not sure you're going to get a better result. You might better result for Taiwan. I think why do it? It goes back to the practice. What we're seeing now is this fundamental change in America's approach. It's being done within the framework that we have. And if you start opening it up and get official about it, get formal about it, I think it's risky, and it could move in a very different direction than you thought.
And also back to the point about strategic clarity versus strategic ambiguity. I mean, polling in Taiwan consistently has shown over years and years and years that the Taiwanese people, they like strategic ambiguity. They don't want to change things. They don't want to declare independence necessarily. They don't want the US to change its, upgrade its unofficial diplomatic partnership to an official one with an alliance and all of that stuff, because it would just provoke Beijing. So I think we need to listen to the people of Taiwan more.
Okay, I'm going to have one last question, and this question is actually an interesting one. The question is, how is China likely to react to the increasing positive attention that Taiwan is receiving from the international community, including, for example, the COVID handling of that, as well as democracy versus authoritarianism? I mean, you're seeing a lot more positive attention that Taiwan is getting, right? Whether it's economic, and so forth. So if I could let each one of you just say a 30-second response to that. Barbara, you have anything to say on that? Perhaps on the economic side, or?
Well, I mean, the short answer is they're not happy about it. I mean, you can see from the WHO or the WHA response, the U.S. pushing and China opposing. So I think that for areas where Taiwan has gotten a lot of positive international attention, it's either been silence from China or has been quiet or very public opposition. And I think that that is likely to continue.
Okay. Derek, Bob?
Yeah. No, I mean, I would just say that it's very interesting that the international community, I think, is increasingly coming to the support of Taiwan. I mean, that G7 statement last week about the WHO, WHA participation, yeah, it angered China, but it also was, I think, the right thing to do, because Taiwan's done a lot on COVID. And this is happening in many different areas, not just with the pandemic. And, it's kind of the future now, or the present.
Yeah, I guess Beijing would have its guard up. Keep in mind that the attractiveness of Taiwan model is mainly developed countries, democracies, that type of thing. Beijing has a good hold on authoritarian governments around the world. Look at how they handled the situation in Xinjiang, and yet they get all these Muslim countries to support them in that situation. So I think one thing they would do is double down in that effort to keep that international coalition, the group that they work with, and that's a very large group, from switching their approach to dealing with Taiwan.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our discussion, but not really, since there are many more questions that I'm afraid I could not get to. But I think we've given a very invigorating and stimulating panel discussion for our hundreds of audience members that were here. And we will, of course, have this on YouTube video for those who want to come back to it or missed it. But let me take a moment to just say how grateful I am to all three of you, Barbara, Bob, and Derek, for joining me in this discussion, really throwing light on so many important questions that are coming up day after day, it seems, on Taiwan, on China, on the US. And seems as if Biden administration is doing sort of, Trump plus, and even more than that. And so we'll have to keep a watch then, because there is stuff happening here. So on behalf of the Sigur Center and myself, big thank you to all of you and a big round of applause virtually. And I hope to see you back here at some point. Bye-bye. Thank you to the
Thanks,
audience.
everyone. Bye. Thank you.